Humans are naturally wired to notice changes in patterns, and relationships are no exception. When a woman consistently gives attention, warmth, and emotional energy, her presence becomes part of the expected rhythm of the connection. He becomes accustomed to her messages, her check-ins, her care, and her engagement. These actions, while meaningful, gradually become familiar. Familiarity does not mean they lose value, but it does mean that the mind adapts and begins to take them for granted. When something is constantly available, the brain assumes it will remain that way. Stability creates comfort, but it can also dull conscious recognition. The effort she has been putting in may have been powerful, but its constant nature hides its true significance. It is only when the pattern changes that the mind begins to notice the depth of what was always there. When a woman stops giving constant attention, even briefly, that rhythm breaks. Silence, in this context, is not emptiness. It is the absence of the expected energy, and the absence itself triggers thought. The man may notice gaps in conversation, delayed responses, or the lack of familiar warmth, and the brain immediately begins processing these changes. Human beings are highly sensitive to shifts in attention, especially when it comes to emotional connections. The brain interprets the disruption as something worth investigating. This disruption creates space for reflection. Without the constant presence, the mind begins to replay memories of interactions, recalling moments that were once taken for granted. Conversations that were once ordinary suddenly feel more meaningful when they are no longer occurring in the same way. The mind searches for understanding, attempting to explain the silence and its implications. Silence creates contrast. When attention is constant, its value blends into the background of daily life. When attention is withdrawn, even temporarily, the difference becomes stark. This contrast forces recognition. The man begins realizing the significance of her effort and the emotional support she has provided. What once seemed ordinary now appears extraordinary because it is no longer automatically available. This contrast awakens curiosity and reflection simultaneously. The brain starts noticing how much her presence influenced his emotional state, how her care and energy supported him, and how much of the relationship's warmth depended on her engagement. He begins to consider what her absence means in terms of connection and investment. Emotional contrast has a profound effect on perception because humans are naturally wired to value what is scarce or uncertain more than what is predictable. Silence also allows for projection. When a woman withdraws attention, the mind fills in the gaps. He may imagine what she is doing, whom she is speaking to, and how she feels about the relationship. Projection is a natural process in human psychology where the mind attempts to predict or create explanations for unknowns. This projection intensifies focus and emotional engagement because it creates a loop of thinking that centers on her. Instead of being distracted by routine or familiarity, he begins devoting attention to understanding her absence, which naturally leads to thinking about her more frequently and deeply. Her quietness does not create confusion because of lack of clarity. It creates curiosity because it disrupts expectation. Another element of this keynote is the awakening of emotional awareness. When a woman goes quiet, it signals to the man that she is no longer offering the same level of energy for the relationship, whether consciously or unconsciously. This shift can make him realize the role she played in creating emotional stability. He begins to notice how much her presence had contributed to his own comfort, happiness, and engagement. The absence of her attention allows him to understand its importance. The moments of care, encouragement, and connection that were once invisible because of consistency become visible in their absence. This sudden awareness often causes him to reconsider the dynamic and reflect on his own participation in the relationship. He may notice times when he relied on her energy without reciprocating fully. Silence also communicates self-respect and independence. A woman who chooses to step back without conflict or explanation demonstrates that she values her own emotional energy and priorities. This quiet confidence is perceived subconsciously as strength. Men often respect and notice this type of strength because it signals emotional maturity and self-reliance. When attention is no longer automatically given, it shows that her presence is intentional. The realization that her emotional engagement is not guaranteed enhances her perceived value and makes him more aware of the loss created by her absence. He begins understanding that her energy, care, and attention were not ordinary or limitless. They were choices she made freely, and those choices now carry weight in his mind. Finally, silence creates emotional space that fosters introspection. Without the constant communication, the mind is free to wander, to question, to analyze, and to evaluate the relationship from a distance. The man starts to remember specific moments, her reactions, her laughter, her support, and the unique qualities she brought into his life. These reflections deepen emotional awareness and create a growing presence in his thoughts. He begins thinking about her more consistently because the silence acts as a mirror, reflecting the value of what he once had but is no longer guaranteed. The first keynote reveals a fundamental truth: absence highlights value. When a woman goes quiet, it is not emptiness that fills the mind, it is recognition. reflection, and realization. The quiet creates thought, and thought builds emotional presence in ways words alone never could. Why a man begins thinking about a woman when she goes quiet lies in the psychology of emotional independence and the magnetic power it creates. Emotional independence is the quiet, steady strength that emerges when a woman stops centering her life entirely around someone else's attention and validation. When a woman constantly gives her energy, time, and focus to a man, even unconsciously, it can unintentionally signal that her happiness depends on his presence. The consistency of this availability, while caring and genuine, can create a subtle predictability. The man begins to assume that no matter how much distance he creates or how distracted he becomes, she will continue showing attention. This perception diminishes urgency and can dull the emotional intensity that initially attracted him. The mind takes constant availability for granted because it seems permanent, reliable, and easy to access. Familiarity creates comfort, but comfort without challenge rarely produces reflection or longing. When a woman stops giving constant attention, even briefly, she introduces a form of emotional independence that naturally changes the dynamic. Her life no longer revolves around the relationship, and her energy is redirected toward her own priorities, goals, and personal growth. She may focus on hobbies, career, friendships, or self-development, all while maintaining calm and dignity. This shift is subtle, but it triggers a profound psychological effect. The man begins to notice that her attention is no longer automatic. Where he once received engagement effortlessly, he now experiences moments of absence. This absence immediately signals that her energy is valuable, not endless. Humans are wired to respond to scarcity. When emotional support and attention are no longer guaranteed, the mind naturally begins to focus more deeply on their source. Emotional independence communicates self-respect and confidence without words. When a woman stops chasing attention, she shows that she values herself enough to protect her energy. This quiet self-assurance is magnetic because it contrasts with the predictability of constant attention. The man begins to see her differently. He notices that her presence is intentional and her engagement meaningful. Her life has its own rhythm and direction, which demonstrates that her happiness does not depend entirely on him. This realization often sparks admiration and respect, even before he consciously acknowledges it. Humans are naturally drawn to strength and autonomy, and emotional independence embodies both. Another critical effect of emotional independence is curiosity. When someone is predictable, the mind relaxes because outcomes are assumed. When unpredictability enters through quietness, selective attention, or absence, the brain instinctively begins to explore, analyze, and attempt to understand the change. The man begins asking himself questions he never considered before. What is she doing now? Why is she focused elsewhere? Did I take her attention for granted? This curiosity pulls her into his thoughts repeatedly, often more than constant engagement ever could. The uncertainty created by her independence makes her presence in his mind more active than ever. Her quietness is not emptiness, it is an invitation for reflection. Emotional independence also highlights the balance of effort in a relationship. When one person constantly gives and the other receives without equal contribution, the dynamic can feel uneven, even if it is subtle. By stepping back, a woman allows the man to experience the space she once filled, which often encourages him to reconsider his own investment. He begins to measure how much effort he is willing to contribute, how much he appreciates the emotional energy she once provided, and whether he wants to take action to maintain the connection. The absence of automatic attention creates a psychological mirror, reflecting the importance of her presence and the value of her engagement. The psychological principle of perceived value also comes into play. When emotional energy is abundant, it can seem ordinary. When it becomes less accessible, its importance becomes clear. The man begins to understand that her attention was not simply a given, it was earned through care, consistency, and genuine investment. He may start reflecting on specific moments where her support, encouragement, or understanding made a difference in his life. These memories, amplified by her current quietness, become meaningful because they are contrasted against the present absence. The emotional impact of her independence forces him to confront what her presence truly meant to him. Independence also cultivates respect. A woman who does not bend or chase validation demonstrates maturity and self-worth. This changes the dynamic from one of dependence to one of choice. Her presence is no longer assumed, it is appreciated. The man begins to understand that her engagement is deliberate, not automatic, and that realization can create admiration and longing. Respect grows because strength and self-possession are attractive qualities, and emotional independence embodies both without drama or manipulation. Finally, emotional independence creates space for reflection and realization. When a woman steps back, the man is left to consider the connection without constant guidance or reassurance. He remembers the warmth, attentiveness, and care she once provided and begins to measure it against the current absence. He begins to understand that her energy, attention, and presence were not ordinary, that they were deeply meaningful, and that they may not be guaranteed if taken for granted. The quiet she creates amplifies his awareness, making her presence more powerful in thought than her constant attention ever was in reality. The second keynote demonstrates a fundamental truth about relationships and human psychology. When a woman becomes emotionally independent, her value is amplified in the mind of the man. By living fully in her own life, protecting her energy, and stepping away from constant engagement, she naturally draws him into reflection, admiration, and recognition of what her presence truly meant. Emotional independence does not require confrontation or effort. It quietly, irresistibly commands attention through absence, dignity, and the undeniable power of self-worth. Humans are naturally drawn to things they do not fully understand. Predictability is comforting, but it is also mundane. When a woman constantly gives her attention, responds to messages quickly, and maintains the emotional flow of the connection, she becomes predictable in ways the mind begins to overlook. Her care and engagement, while genuine, can begin to feel ordinary because they are always present. The brain begins to assume stability and takes her energy for granted, not because of lack of appreciation, but because familiarity dulls conscious awareness. Once the pattern shifts, once the constant presence is interrupted, the unfamiliarity triggers curiosity, attention, and reflection in ways that consistent engagement never could. When a woman goes quiet, she introduces the element of unpredictability. She no longer responds immediately. She no longer fills every silence with conversation. She no longer chases attention or seeks validation. This subtle withdrawal changes the emotional landscape of the connection. The brain perceives this absence as a puzzle. The familiar rhythm is gone, and in that gap, the mind begins trying to understand what happened. Humans are wired to focus on unresolved or unexpected patterns because attention is a tool for problem solving and survival. Her quietness triggers a natural psychological response. He begins thinking about her more frequently, attempting to decode the reasons behind the change. Mystery is magnetic because it creates cognitive engagement. When someone is fully predictable, the mind does not need to work to understand them. When unpredictability is introduced, the brain engages in analysis, speculation, and projection. The man begins asking questions. Why has she become distant? What is she focusing on now? Does she still care? Did I take her attention for granted? These questions generate repeated mental focus because the answers are not immediately available. The uncertainty makes her presence mentally and emotionally more significant than when she was always accessible. Her silence does not create confusion for the sake of manipulation. It simply shifts the dynamic from certainty to curiosity, which naturally commands more thought. This mystery also amplifies emotional contrast. When attention is constant, its value blends into daily life. When attention is withdrawn, its absence highlights its previous impact. The man begins reflecting on the moments she actively engaged, supported, or encouraged him. Conversations that once seemed ordinary now appear meaningful. Gestures of care and patience that were once overlooked are suddenly recognized as significant. The contrast between the past presence and the current quietness sharpens awareness of her emotional contribution. He begins to realize that her involvement was never automatic. It required effort, attention, and care, and that realization deepens his focus on her. Another powerful effect of mystery is the creation of emotional longing. Humans are naturally drawn to things that require attention, effort, or thought. The brain equates challenge with value. When a woman steps back, she is no longer emotionally accessible in the same way, and that scarcity makes her presence more desirable. The man begins to notice that he misses her input, her reactions, and her guidance in conversations. The desire to reconnect or understand her behavior grows stronger because the emotional energy she once provided is no longer guaranteed. This creates a subtle but powerful pull toward reflection and awareness. The third keynote also reveals the psychological effect of projection. In her absence, the man begins imagining her life, her thoughts, and her feelings. His mind attempts to fill in the gaps created by her quietness, and in doing so, he thinks about her more than he did when she was constantly present. He envisions scenarios, recalls memories, and replays past interactions, all of which deepen her presence in his thoughts. Projection intensifies emotional engagement because the unknown is inherently stimulating to the mind. The more he attempts to understand her, the more he centers her in his awareness. Mystery also communicates confidence and self-possession. By going quiet, a woman shows that she does not need constant validation or external attention to feel secure. She demonstrates that her life, happiness, and priorities exist independently of his reactions. This quiet independence signals strength and self-respect, which the mind perceives as both attractive and intriguing. Her silence conveys intentionality. She is not absent by accident or caprice. She is intentionally redirecting her energy, which makes her presence, when it does appear, far more valuable and significant. Additionally, Unpredictability fosters self-reflection in the man. The shift in her behavior forces him to evaluate his own contributions and emotional investment. He begins to consider whether he appreciated her attention, valued her presence, or reciprocated the effort she once freely offered. This introspection often leads to deeper recognition of her worth and a greater awareness of the emotional dynamics he may have previously overlooked. Her quietness acts as a mirror, reflecting not just her value, but also the imbalance or lack of awareness that may have existed before. The third keynote demonstrates a fundamental principle: mystery amplifies presence. Silence, unpredictability, and emotional independence create mental space, stimulate curiosity, and ignite reflection. When a woman goes quiet, she does not need to fight for attention or force recognition. Her absence, combined with her calm self-possession, naturally draws him into thinking about her more intensely. By introducing mystery into the connection, she transforms her quietness into a powerful force that commands awareness, admiration, and emotional engagement. The mind is compelled to fill in the gaps, recognize value, and reflect on the significance of her presence, creating a magnetic pull that consistent attention could never achieve. Human beings respond powerfully to differences between what is and what was. When a woman is consistently present, consistently attentive, and consistently engaged, her energy becomes part of the background of daily life. Her messages, her care, and her emotional warmth are always there, and the mind gradually begins to normalize them. Familiarity, while comfortable, can also diminish conscious recognition of value. The more predictable something becomes, the less effort the brain invests in appreciating it. The emotional support, the encouragement, and the interest she provides may be deeply meaningful, yet when it is always available, it can go unnoticed. The moment she changes that rhythm, the mind is forced to notice, to reflect, and to evaluate, creating a powerful psychological effect. When a woman goes quiet, she introduces contrast. The patterns of attention, communication, and warmth that once flowed continuously are no longer guaranteed. This absence highlights the previous presence. The conversations that used to feel ordinary suddenly stand out in memory. The messages that once arrived without delay become notable because they are no longer predictable. The emotional energy that once surrounded the connection becomes visible through its absence. Contrast is a fundamental principle of perception. The difference between what exists now and what once existed creates awareness. It forces the mind to measure the importance of what was previously taken for granted. This contrast triggers reflection. The man begins to notice what he previously overlooked. He recalls the moments when her care made a difference in his life. He remembers how she listened patiently when he needed to speak, how she encouraged him when he doubted himself, and how her presence made ordinary moments feel meaningful. The absence of her attention now brings these memories into sharper focus. Her engagement, once so familiar that it faded into the background, is now appreciated in its absence. He begins to understand that her energy was never automatic. It required effort, thought, and emotional investment. Emotional contrast also highlights the imbalance of effort that may have existed in the relationship. When one person constantly gives and the other receives without full awareness or reciprocity, the contribution can blend into daily life and go unnoticed. By stepping back and going quiet, a woman allows the man to experience the absence of her effort firsthand. He begins to recognize the role she played in creating the emotional stability and warmth of the connection. This awareness can lead to appreciation and reflection, because it becomes clear how much her energy shaped the relationship's emotional dynamics. Another critical element of this keynote is perceived scarcity. Humans naturally place higher value on what is rare or uncertain. When attention, care, and engagement are always available, their perceived worth is diminished. When a woman stops giving constant attention, her energy becomes less predictable and therefore more significant. The man begins to realize that her presence is not a guarantee, that her emotional investment has limits, and that her attention must be earned rather than assumed. This perception enhances the value of her presence and increases the focus he places on her in thought. The psychological effect of contrast also deepens emotional longing. When something meaningful disappears, even temporarily, it creates a sense of incompleteness. The man may find himself thinking about the moments they shared, imagining her reactions, or remembering the ways she contributed to his life. Her quietness is not emptiness. It is the space in which awareness grows. The contrast between the past and present allows him to measure what was truly important, and the mind naturally centers on filling that gap. Contrast also affects the perception of intentionality. By going quiet, a woman communicates without words that her attention is not endless, that her presence is a choice, and that her engagement is meaningful when it occurs. This intentionality changes the dynamic because he begins to see her energy as deliberate, not automatic. Her silence signals strength, self-respect, and the ability to prioritize her own emotional well-being. He begins to view her with a combination of admiration and heightened awareness because her presence is no longer something he can take for granted. Another effect of emotional contrast is self-reflection. The man begins to evaluate his own contributions, considering whether he appreciated her attention when it was constant, whether he matched her effort, and whether he truly recognized the value of her engagement. This reflection often leads to a deeper understanding of her significance and a growing awareness of what the relationship might feel like without her emotional support. Finally, contrast enhances memory and emotional focus. The absence of attention brings previous interactions into sharper clarity. Every gesture, every message, every moment of care that once seemed ordinary now appears extraordinary because it is contrasted against the present quietness. The brain naturally prioritizes these differences, creating repeated mental engagement with her presence even when she is absent. Emotional contrast amplifies recognition, reflection, and longing, making her more significant in thought than when she was always available. The fourth keynote demonstrates a fundamental truth. Absence amplifies value through contrast. When a woman goes quiet, she creates a psychological space in which the man begins to measure, reflect, and appreciate her presence in ways that constant attention could never achieve. The difference between past engagement and current silence forces awareness, inspires reflection, and deepens recognition of her true significance. When a woman consistently invests her attention, care, and energy into a relationship, her presence can create a sense of comfort and stability for the man. He becomes accustomed to her messages, her encouragement, her warmth, and her availability. Over time. This constancy can unintentionally make her emotional investment less visible because it blends into the routine of daily life. Humans tend to undervalue what is predictable, and the brain often takes continuous support for granted. The effort she provides, though immense and meaningful, can appear ordinary simply because it has always been there. It is only when that energy is withdrawn that its true significance begins to reveal itself. When a woman goes quiet, she introduces the first hint of absence. This absence immediately creates a psychological shift. The man notices that the conversations are not flowing in the same way. Messages do not arrive as frequently. The warmth and attention that once came naturally are no longer guaranteed. This disruption triggers an internal evaluation. The human mind reacts to missing patterns because it is wired to recognize and assess changes in its environment. Her quietness interrupts the expected emotional flow, forcing him to pay attention to what he previously overlooked. The absence becomes a mirror, reflecting the depth of her contribution to the relationship. As the silence continues, he begins reflecting on the past. He recalls moments when her attention and care made a tangible difference. The time she listened patiently when he struggled, the moments she encouraged him during challenges, the gestures of support he once took for granted, they all resurface in his memory. The contrast between her previous presence and current quietness highlights the value of her emotional investment. Her effort is no longer invisible. It stands out because the brain is processing its absence. Humans are naturally more aware of what they may lose than what they have in abundance. This awareness triggers a deep emotional response that brings her to the forefront of his thoughts. This keynote also involves recognition of emotional labor, the consistent effort she put into the relationship. Maintaining harmony, offering understanding, listening actively, providing encouragement requires energy, patience, and intentionality. When that labor is suddenly absent, the man begins to perceive how much work she invested in creating the emotional stability of the relationship. The realization grows that her presence was not effortless or automatic. It was intentional, meaningful, and essential. This recognition can awaken gratitude, longing, and reflection simultaneously as he begins to understand what he may have overlooked while it was consistently available. Her quietness also introduces the concept of perceived scarcity. When attention and care are no longer guaranteed, they become more valuable. The human mind instinctively prioritizes what is limited, rare, or uncertain. Her emotional energy, once abundant, is now recognized as precious because it is no longer automatic. The man begins to measure what he has taken for granted and begins to notice the ways in which her presence contributed to his sense of security, happiness, and fulfillment. This perception encourages deeper contemplation and emotional engagement. He begins to see her as someone whose presence is significant, intentional, and worthy of effort. Another aspect of this keynote is self-reflection. The absence of her attention encourages the man to evaluate his own behavior. He begins asking whether he appreciated her presence enough, whether he reciprocated her effort, and whether he truly recognized the value of the emotional support she provided. He may notice moments where he relied on her without giving in return. This introspection is critical because it allows him to understand the imbalance that may have existed and prompts him to reconsider the way he values the connection. Her quietness creates a psychological space in which he is forced to confront his own awareness and responsibility. The fifth keynote also emphasizes the power of intentional withdrawal. Her quietness is not passive. It is deliberate. By stepping back without drama or manipulation, she communicates that her attention is meaningful and that her energy is finite. This intentionality increases her perceived value because it demonstrates self-respect and autonomy. The man begins to understand that her presence is not guaranteed and that her engagement is a choice rather than an expectation. This realization heightens his emotional focus and draws him into deeper thought about the relationship and about her as a person. Finally, the combination of absence, reflection, and recognition creates emotional longing. He begins to notice what is missing, the warmth, the encouragement, the connection, and in doing so, he also begins to appreciate what she provided. Her quietness amplifies the emotional significance of her presence and encourages him to internalize its value. He cannot ignore the gap she creates, and in that gap, he begins to see clearly the true importance of her attention, care, and emotional investment. The fifth keynote demonstrates a crucial principle. When a woman goes quiet, the absence of her consistent attention and emotional energy allows a man to recognize, reflect on, and fully appreciate her contribution. Silence forces awareness, encourages introspection, and reveals value in ways constant presence cannot. Her withdrawal is not emptiness, it is the catalyst for realization, understanding, and the awakening of recognition for the depth of her presence in his life. When a woman consistently gives attention, care, and energy, her presence becomes a source of stability and comfort in a man's life. He grows accustomed to it, often without fully noticing the depth of her investment, because familiarity dulls conscious recognition. Humans naturally take what is always present for granted. The brain assumes that her attention, support, and engagement will remain available indefinitely, which reduces urgency and reflection. It is only when that presence is removed, even temporarily, that its true impact begins to register. Her quietness creates a shift in perception, and in that space, the mind begins to process the significance of what was once constant. When she steps back, the first effect is the perception of absence. He notices the conversations that no longer flow in the same way, the warmth that once accompanied interactions that is now missing, and the attentiveness that he may have overlooked before. This absence triggers evaluation because the human mind instinctively reacts to changes in patterns, especially when those patterns involve emotional support or connection. The silence forces him to confront what he previously assumed would always exist. Her energy, previously invisible because of consistency, now stands out sharply. The contrast between what was and what is now creates awareness and begins to draw his attention inward. Emotional consequence is amplified because humans are wired to respond to potential loss. The possibility of losing someone important naturally increases focus and reflection. When a woman goes quiet, she introduces the risk that her emotional investment is not guaranteed, and this triggers deeper thought. The man begins replaying memories and considering interactions with more intentionality. He notices the ways her presence shaped his daily experience, the comfort she offered during difficult moments, and the emotional support she provided consistently. Her absence turns these elements from routine background features into salient reminders of value, prompting him to think about her more often and more intensely. Her quietness also emphasizes the intentionality behind her presence. By stepping back, she demonstrates that her attention is not automatic. She shows that her energy is finite and that her engagement must be respected. This communicates self-worth and independence, which naturally garners recognition. The man begins to see that her presence is meaningful not because it is constant, but because it is chosen. Intentional withdrawal forces him to understand that her attention, care, and connection are earned and appreciated, not assumed. This realization amplifies his emotional focus because he begins to perceive her value in a way that familiarity never allowed. Another critical element is reflection on personal behavior. When a woman goes quiet, the man is confronted with the gap left by her absence, and he begins to examine his own role in the dynamic. He may consider whether he fully appreciated her presence, whether he reciprocated her effort, or whether he took her attention for granted. The silence forces him to analyze the balance of energy in the relationship and confront any moments of neglect or inattention. This introspection increases emotional engagement because he is no longer passively receiving her presence. He is actively considering its significance and the ways it has shaped his life. The psychology of longing is also a major factor. Her quietness creates space for desire to emerge. The brain, noticing the absence, begins to dwell on what is missing. The man starts to recall the emotional warmth, encouragement, and connection she once provided. He imagines her life, her thoughts, and her feelings filling in the void created by her withdrawal. This projection intensifies focus and draws her into his thoughts more frequently than ever before. The absence of constant attention makes her presence psychologically more compelling than when it was guaranteed. Scarcity increases perceived value, and the mind naturally prioritizes what is uncertain or potentially lost. Additionally, her quietness communicates strength without words. It shows that she does not require constant validation and that her life and happiness exist independently. This demonstration of self-respect is magnetic because it signals emotional maturity and autonomy. The man recognizes that her engagement is not a given and that her presence carries weight. Strength presented through calm withdrawal is often more impactful than words, explanations, or confrontations because it allows the mind to process significance on its own terms. Finally, the combination of absence, reflection, and recognition creates clarity. Her quietness forces him to see what he may have overlooked, appreciate what he may have undervalued, and consider the true depth of her presence. The gap she creates does not simply make her noticeable, it encourages evaluation of the emotional bond, the significance of her investment, and the consequences of taking her for granted. This awareness draws her into his thoughts continually, and the psychological power of her quietness transforms recognition into reflection, admiration, and longing. The sixth keynote demonstrates a fundamental principle: withdrawal of attention, executed with calm confidence and independence, creates a psychological space in which the man realizes the true impact of her presence. Absence highlights value, intentionality amplifies significance, and reflection fosters recognition. When a woman goes quiet, her energy, care, and engagement are no longer assumed, and in that shift, the mind begins to understand and appreciate her in ways that constant presence could never achieve.